Good morning to my fellow panelists, and good afternoon, everyone in the audience over in Australia. My name is Alvin Pang, and I'm a Singapore-based poet, editor, writer, and occasional translator. And welcome to our panel session today, titled "Connection and Community in a Time of Crisis." I've gathered here with me today a group of dear friends and fellow writers, and I'd like to begin just by introducing everyone to you in no particular order of merit. We have with us Ranjit Hoskote, based in Bombay, India, who is a poet, essayist, and translator. His collections of poetry include Vanishing Acts, Central Time, Jonah Whale, and the most recent Hunch Prose. His translation of a celebrated 14th century Kashmiri woman mystic's poetry has appeared as I, Lalal, the Poems of Laudit from Penguin Classics. And his own poems have been translated into German, Hindi, Bengali, Spanish, Swedish, and other languages. And he is, of course, also a distinguished visual arts curator. So welcome, Ranjit.
Great to be here, Alvin, and to be with everyone this morning or afternoon.
So also with us is Yvonne Owuor from Nairobi, Kenya, who is currently a resident artist in residence in Daad, Berlin. She is a novelist. Her debut novelist, Dust, was shortlisted for the 2015 Folio Prize, and her much acclaimed second novel, The Dragonfly Sea, which features an ancestor of mine, was launched in 2019. Everyone, please welcome Yvonne, who comes from us very early in the morning.
Thank you so much. Greetings, everybody. Yeah, good to see you all.
Next, we have Kyoko Yoshida, short story writer, scholar, and translator, who is the author of story collections Disorientalism and Spring Sleepers. She writes fiction in English and translates between English and Japanese. And she teaches American literature at Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto. Hello, Kyoko in Kyoto.
Hi, Alvin. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good to be here.
And our next guest, fourth guest, is Ellen van Neerven. Probably not a stranger to the audience. She's an award-winning writer of Mununjali and Dutch heritage. Her most recent award, her most recent collection, Throat, received 3 awards, including Book of the Year in the 2021 New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. And she's also the editor of the recent anthology Flock, First Nation Stories, Then and Now. And she hails from the Brisbane area, isn't that right? Ellen, hello, thank you, and welcome.
Hello, hi everyone, good to be here.
So why are we here today? Well, we're here to have a conversation. It's been a difficult time for everyone, let's put it that way, in the world. The pandemic has disrupted just about every aspect of life, but it's also, I think, sharpened divisions both within societies and between them. And, the drums of war, as it were, are beating once again, even as we are struggling with this humanity-wide virus. And these are uncertain times, but also times that separate peoples and separate individuals. We felt as fellow writers that all the more in a time like this, it was important to think about and talk about and find ways to connect and resume and build up and shore up the resources of a sense of community. All the more because there are forces, seeking to keep us apart. These, my dear friends, have in one way or other been connected with each other and with myself over the years. I've met most of them in more than one city in the world, through festivals, through conferences, through residencies. And, having met them has been a great privilege in my life. And they've given me really a glimpse into the wisdom of realizing that, we do have a common humanity. We do have things we care about and believe in. We do hold values deeply in common. And even the differences that sometimes can bog us down, at the differences and difficulties, aren't things we bear alone, really. And I think it's very important for us to maintain and find these connections. I would love to hear, to start us off, what everyone here has to say. We will have each of them share their thoughts on this topic, which is very dear to my heart. And then we will have a chat with each other about it. And very quickly, we will try and open up to the audience, and we hope that you'll join in our conversation as well. Feel free to pose your questions. I think there is a Q&A system in Microsoft Teams, and we'll try and pick up the questions you have and try and address them and weave it into our conversation. And in spending these hours together, we are, as we were saying in the green room earlier, we too are nourishing and nurturing and holding ourselves up. These are the sort of encounters and meetings that keep us going, that we cherish. And we hope that it will help you as well in the audience. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here again. Maybe we'll start. I thought we would start from west to east, as it were, and begin with the writer who's furthest west from us at the moment. And whether she's at home in Nairobi or like right now in Berlin, I think Yvonne is our leading lady. Take it away, Yvonne.
Thank you so much, and hello again to guests on this thing. The theme: connection, community, and crisis. The kind of 3 C's in this time of not just uncertainty, in this cauldron of our current reality, has kind of driven me to. I'm less confident about statements, but what has emerged more is our questions, and I think I just jotted a couple of these questions for us to explore. So in lieu of newt's eyes and frog's toes in this cauldron, I'll offer you the questions. So the urgency of the evolution of a new lexicon grammar of us and the world, that becomes very, very, very apparent. So what does living with uncertainty now mean? How do we befriend or teach ourselves to befriend the unknown? And also, what do we do with the reality, I think, to the very overtness of our ephemerality? We are as transitory as fireflies, isn't that right? So is it necessary to learn also to step away from the delusion rather than illusion of a permanence? What does that mean? What does that then mean for the future? And how then does a future erupt out of the so-called, a series of crises? Currently, the Indo-Pacific posturings, which actually really, really annoys me because it is so unnecessary. This impulse towards violence and war and brutality. We should have outlived that. I think one of the things that I feel I need to assert around, or what kind of pisses me off around the Indo-Pacific posturing, is that it's just our global monsoon complex, the 1,000-year-old global monsoon complex, the long cultures of interaction and trade that has happened across our oceans for over 1,000 years. But this Indo-Pacific naming and posturing is the reinsertion of Washington, inscribing itself into the lives of our waters, of the waters that our cultures and peoples have long interacted with and have managed to do so peacefully. But then, what then? How do we even have a stake then? What do we do with that particular reality? What then does history have a say in the kind of contemporary framing or reshaping or resculpturing of these particular waters, and in this kind of violent way? What is our artistic imperative in the image creation, imagining process? Are we obliged actually as artists to have a statement, a stake, an opinion, a refusal? Yeah. How do we also live out the multipolarities in a world where forced unipolarity, in a world of forced unipolarities, and where multipolarities are treated as if they are a threat, a civilizational threat, a threat to democracy, a threat to human rights? And then what then do we do? And look, please don't think that I'm speaking about our world or our opinions or our own positions as if we are victims. We're not. I'm merely asking questions linked to an idea that constantly imposes itself with violence, with lying, with a pretense of order. The Trinity: democracy, human rights, and rule of law. But when lifted against the realities like Afghanistan, all of that falls apart. But rather than falling apart, what happens is a kind of global gaslighting. I mention that because then we are co-opted and obligated to engage in the fiction, to amplify the fiction, for all practical reasons, like making a living, for example. Is resistance futile? What then do we do with a nation state in a world where oceanic regionalisms are also now being reinforced as if these are nation states? Alvin, your work talks a lot about confluence, and I've started to use it quite a bit, especially the fluidities, the blurrings of lines, the possibilities embedded in the mixing, the merging, and the becoming. And part of the reason I was holding on to it is because it's the kind of the elemental resistance to the limits of the nation state. What if there's a historical pivoting, a zeitgeist of the universe that's also reimagining itself and us in it? What then does it mean? What then is our call then as artists? What also then does that mean for the changing climate of the Earth? What if that was happening as a means of the climate, the universal climate, evolving itself? What then does that do to the current tropes and expectations, and also the narrative being put forth, right? And also, again, to pivot ourselves very sharply. I told you this was a cauldron with all sorts of, strange elements. Look, what would it mean if, in order for us to restart the Earth and to build new communities and to reimagine ourselves in new ways, what if one of the things we needed to do, in view of the immensities of the unresolved and unacknowledged wounds, what if the only way was forgiveness? Would it be an admission of defeat, or would it be an act of courage? And what would forgiveness as tabula rasa actually offer for the reimagination of worlds, of ourselves? We understand very much, I think, certainly I do, that the main war being fought is in the realm of the imagination and in the idea of the future. As artists then, does the artist thinker have a role to play? Actually, not just a role, have a responsibility in if necessary, forcing their way into reshaping, resculpturing, and defining both, and doing both with intention. So the human manufactured crisis, and they are all human manufactured, is usually generated for the benefit of a few, and is always linked to profit, to greed, to the lust for power and control. Rather than raging at the dying of the light, does that awareness then serve perhaps as a call, a kind of artistic and imaginational call to arms? And what might that look like? And I personally am invested in the idea. I'm invested in the kind of memory game or the imagination game of imagining plot lines for a different kind of way. I think I'll stop right there.
Thank you. Thank you, Yvonne, for that very provocative reflection. And the question I got from that, which you have so articulated, is, in a world where our stories, our collective stories, are being written by warriors, by the bellicose, how then do writers fight? If it is warriors who write our stories, how do storytellers fight back, and what do we fight for? And I think your very wise question of whether forgiveness is a strategy in this context. It's a very provocative one, and one that I hope to take up in conversation. You also mentioned the environment as another looming crisis, and certainly, we know the COVID isn't the only crisis that besets us. Climate change is an issue that, again, cuts across boundaries, even as we seek to erect walls and borders. We are confronted more and more by situations and disasters and crises that require us to pull together, not pull apart. And I suspect that our next speaker has a lot to say about that as well. And can I invite Ranjit to come in at this point? Thank you, Ranjit.
Thanks so much, Alvin. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I was really moved by what Yvonne had to say, particularly about the possibility of forgiveness. And I hope we'll come back to that question. But for myself, I've actually been thinking through these since this crisis began, of how it's actually exacerbated things we were struggling with over the last 5 or 6 years, at least. So, and we're all now very aware of this, of course, but I just thought I'd flag some of these points. Certainly, looking at it from a South Asian point of view, I think what's happened within the planet-wide crisis is also the way in which there's a certain enhancement of authoritarian possibilities within politics under the cloak or camouflage of the public health crisis. What we see is all forms of authoritarian control, centralization, patriarchy being rigorously enforced. And certainly we see that in South Asia and elsewhere. So on the one hand, you have all kinds of capitalist processes which are at a peak. The greed that has characterized a certain choice of political economy, in which we've reduced the whole planet to just nothing more than an seemingly endless reservoir of resources, and the way in which we've exploited fellow human beings, other species. All of this is that it's really brought us to this pass in some ways. And I'd not just once, but many times, I found myself thinking of parts of the earth where the human presence has been excluded, and what has happened there. I've been thinking of Chernobyl, for instance. I've been thinking of the DMZ, which divides the two Koreas. And all the scientific evidence suggests that if you take the human species out of the equation, the planet is perfectly able to regenerate itself even after, military crisis, a nuclear disaster, and it sets you thinking. I mean, we clearly are the problem. It's very clear. It's we see ourselves necessarily as the fulcrum from which all of experience is to be judged. We see ourselves as the sovereign species, but we should remind ourselves of what Gregory Bateson, the pioneer of cybernetics and anthropologist, said at some point, that the species that is smarter than its environment is probably doomed. So the way in which we've transmogrified our environment, we're the only species that sets out to destroy its habitat. So this is these visions of Tarkovsky-esque zones that are regenerating themselves in our absence. That has strongly been with me, but it's clearly not the solution. I mean, despite our best efforts, we're not going to eliminate ourselves from the planetary narrative. So that being so, how do we respond? And I would actually agree with Yvonne that there are histories that we need to draw on, histories of solidarity, philosophies of caring and healing, which are present to us. They've been pushed to the margins because they don't seem to have positivist or profitable outcomes. But it's probably the only way in which we can pull back. And thinking about connection and community in a time of crisis particularly, I found myself so sustained during this period by conversations like this one. And it really reminds me of a time before the rise of global capital. Forms of engagement, forms of exchange, forms of cultural collaboration, in a time when these things were possible through modes of mutual curiosity, forms of making. And Yvonne, you spoke of confluences, and that really was the title of a book that Ilya Troyanov, the German novelist, and I wrote more than over a decade ago. And what we were doing in that book was really to think about some of these historical moments where people came together along trade routes, across the oceans, places where borders were not marked out that clearly. And difference was only one of the ways in which people responded to each other. Difference did not become the ground for mutual annihilation. Difference rather was the starting point for curiosity, for finding out how another imagination worked, how another culture worked. And I think it's to me, these are sources of great inspiration. Also in my recent writing, the way it's turning, it's really to recover these lost languages of solidarity, and to see how we don't come to culture with ready-made identities. We come with provisional identities. And the whole point of conversation and of collaboration is that we produce something new that we didn't have ready-made and present to us, which is also something that I think many of us in our particular societies and nation states, we have to cherish this ideal, because everywhere, especially at this time of crisis and sealed borders, we're being told by influential political forces that it's good to redefine yourself against the other. You need to have an internally consistent identity that you present against whatever might be coming. But the internally consistent identity in that sense is really it's a phantom. We've throughout history, we've nourished ourselves constantly by contact with the other, with the outside. And I think that's how we're going to really preserve ourselves and preserve what's best in our impulses, really, by just constantly being responsive and dialogic towards the other. I think to me, it's a basis for how to be a cultural subjectivity, but also a political subjectivity. I think especially at a time when we're seeing the consequences of forced migrations on an unbelievable scale. Every society is addressing this question of how to deal with the other within. And complex theories are developed for this, but I think what's needed is really a certain everyday form of being with the other. Yvonne, you're in Berlin, and it's one of my favorite cities. There's also a very particular Berlin word for neighborhood, the Kiez. It's a German word, but it's actually of Slavic origin, and it speaks of the comfort of being in a certain neighborhood with all of its everyday textures. And the question I've always had is, the Kiez should be seen not as a sedimented comfort of constantly predictable relationships, but rather it's about waking up every day and dealing with what's unpredictable, learning a new language, learning a new shape of thought. And that to me is, I'm going to close with this idea of the Kiez, the osmotic neighborhood. How we deal with things not only at an abstract and theoretical level, but also in our everyday life. And what are the kinds of survival skills, if you will, that we need to develop to address these changed realities? What are we called upon to do? How do we expand our consciousness and our sensibilities? So I've always been a vocal fan of this idea of multiplicity, polyglossia, working across languages and cultures. And I think that's really the sanest and most productive and generative way to be. And I'll close with that thought.
Ranjit, thank you so much for that. So much resonant with ideas I care about and values I care about. We've had these conversations, I think, when we last met in India and elsewhere. Yvonne and I, we were talking about ideas of confluence as well. And again and again, this notion of, refusing the lure, the easy allure of the singular truth, right? The sort of the narrow track, the sort of firm, static, and fixed idea of who we are, flags rather than handshakes, as it were. I think it's increasingly very more and more necessary, more and more dangerous to cling to these ideas of singularities, and more necessary to look past these ideas, to explore. I love the notion of an osmotic neighborhood, because it suggests not just that the self is porous, a membrane as it were, but that we can live in community like that. And perhaps both of yourself and Yvonne have been saying, perhaps we have for a long time. These are not new ideas. We come from cultures with very long and deep histories of trade and exchange. What we call our cultures today, whether we choose to admit it or not, across the world, it's the outcome of these fluid exchanges, these mixes. So in a sense, we're going back to our original nourishment as peoples, and as cultures. And we do, and the other point that you raised that I think is important to bring out is our relationship with what we call the non-human. The relationship of the human to what we call the non-human. And human beings like to think of ourselves as the protagonists of the planet and of the universe. We are the heroes of the story, as it were. And some think that they're heroes among the heroes, as it were. But maybe it's time to rethink that narrative entirely. How do, if even our very language of how we tell stories requires us to have a protagonist, to have a hero, how then can we shift out of that mindset and think about a way in which we can tell stories that make space for all the forces that makes the world of the story possible? And it's an open question that perhaps we can explore later on. I do want to hear now from Kyoko, whom I know is working in her way on ways to bridge some of these divides. She herself works in translation. I heard that she's also working on a writer's residency, yet another way in which we try and break down some of these barriers that in a sense divide us. Have we ever thought, for example, why is it that we always categorize writers by our nationalities, as if that is the most important thing about us? Have you noticed that? And it's such a habit that we all fall into it. And yet we are people together, we are friends together, we are flesh together, and perhaps there are other ways to think about our relations and how we present ourselves that may matter. Let's hear from Kyoko.
Thank you, Alvin. Thank you, Yvonne and Ranjit, for really extraordinary questions and provocations. I'm going to talk about the residency project and some of the issues and questions I came across as I work on it. So just a few years ago, we decided we're going to start the residency in Kyoto. And the thing is, this is going to be the first international writers residency in Japan. We never had a real writers residency. There are kind of, for instance, that the French government has its own residency in Japan for French writers, but we never had, Japanese organization, welcoming international authors to Japan. And so, like Alvin said, why are we kind of, the divided by nationalities? But at the same time, it is because the literary art is written by language, and this language barrier makes this art very special. But at the same time, it becomes as a hurdle for international exchanges, unlike visual art or cinematic art. And so now that I hear that the people prefer to watch YouTube or TikTok rather than read blogs, so like how-to instructions, they'd rather watch rather than read. So the visual moving image is becoming the major medium of communication. And in such environment, what do we do? And one of the things I wanted to, I noticed as Ranjit was talking about the relationships between politics and economics, and our practice is that politics is still, it's the realm of language as well. And that's one of the reasons why people tend to build this kind of internal, identities within its own language. And even in different Englishes we speak, that each culture and each nation has, the different connotations for certain words, or, the historical background to, certain the phrases, etc. And still that the people talk about the, politicians, visual images and appearing on TV, etc. But still, I think that the language is still the major medium of political discourse. So that's something that, it's a barrier, but that it's a medium that we share with the politics. And because we decided we're going to start residency, but then the COVID came, so we cannot do face-to-face residencies, not yet. And because we're an independent organization, we have to raise money. So, it's not like a Japanese government is doing that. So we have to, gather money to invite people at all. So we're working on that. But meanwhile, there are so many. We have so many events online now, that I never had so many chances to meet, writers in different countries, and have conversations. But so this is wonderful, and we thought about doing some sort of online event instead of doing face-to-face residencies. But I think our love, our why every one of us got into this field is our love for books, and I wanted to do more like paper thingy. So our current project is the residency in print project, and we made it our challenge so we had this call for submissions from around the world, and we just closed the taking submissions a few weeks ago, and we're now reading all those submissions. We got about 80 submissions in about 12 different languages. And we made it a challenge that we promise we're gonna read any language. And once we like it, we will translate any language into Japanese, because I know so that, that reaching somebody in Japanese academia, or, the NPO people who travel different parts of the world in different works, we can find somebody who can read some, any language, and with, collaborations with other writers and, speakers, we can translate them. And that it's just amazing that, we have such a common stories to tell, like Yvonne said, but approaches are so different, even in the same language of English. Majority of the submissions were in English. And so this is something, so we tell the same stories in a way, but in such different ways. So this is one of the things. Another thing is the role of translation. We all come from except me. Japan is such a monolingual country, but you all come from multilingual environment, right? Because of, the settler colonialism, or, the imperialism, different, histories. And what's the role of English? I mean, English has this dominance because of global trade and, economy, but is that the only reason that we exchange ideas in English now? Well, it's just out of convenience, but what are the differences of English? And also, how do you, for instance, Ellen, that the languages are disappearing, in Australia, and how do we preserve this multiple, the multitude of languages, diversities, and translating into English is one way, but it also kind of, accelerates the elimination of different languages as well. So this is a conundrum. We want to translate more into English, but the more you translate into English, the stronger that language becomes. So yeah, I stop here, but this is something I would like to talk about with you guys.
Kyoko, thank you. Really taking us down to the ground, as it were, of where the fight is, which is on the page, in our words, in the things that writers do on a day-to-day basis to get by, and also to seek and actually create those connections. Through the books we make, through the translations, we try and create residencies and other opportunities. And I think you've hit on language as a very important aspect of that. There is a way in which we make certain assumptions about how, if everyone can use English, that's a common language, and it's not to be trivialized that gives us a way to communicate and connect, but it is not the only way, and it also excludes us from many other conversations as well. So the challenge is, how can we work past some of these constraints in order to seek the connections that we need to make and recover healthier histories and healthier ways of being, as it were. And just using the term health, it's not about right or wrong, as it were, but what is healthy, what will sustain us, what is sustainable, even what will nourish us going forward. I just want to throw a provocation on top of yours, which is, the commercial world is doing this. You've got Google Translate, you've got AI translations. We are doing this for the things that the market cares about. So the challenge is, how then can we also bring some of these opportunities, technologies, intelligences, research efforts into other areas, other spheres of life that also matter, right? Can we transcend these boundaries, not just in the making of goods and services, as it were, but also these other human goods and human services, as it were, that also matter. I'd like to now pass the mic over to Ellen. And wonderful to hear from you, Ellen. Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Yeah, cool. Jingari Jindiwala. I'm on Yagara and Turrbal Dargan. The city I'm on is Yagara name is Mianjin, otherwise known as Brisbane, and I'm really really grateful to be here today. It's just been really good soul food to be listening to the four of you. And I've taken so many notes, being the last one to speak, that I'm not even sure how much sense I'm going to be making. But I'm really bouncing off all four of you. So I'll just say some things. Firstly, to Kyoko, you were speaking about language. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about language, and I think we're in times where there's so many questions of justice, and questions of language justice is really quite important. And so I do think about in so-called Australia, we have so many different First Nations groups that all have their own language, and because of the very, very different ways mobs were colonized, those languages are all very different kind of usages. So for example, where I'm from, the region where I'm from, what we're currently seeing now is language revival. So languages that were pushed to the margins, people being threats of violence to speak language. You have to speak English, you can't speak your language, you can't practice your culture, to a period now in the last 30 years that has been because of a lot of hard work and wanting to put language on the tongues of future generations. And I'm not just talking about Aboriginal people, I'm talking about everybody that lives on this land, to understand the context and understand the language and the values of this place, pre-colonization, ongoing colonization, it should be said. So yeah, I think we're at a really interesting place in time and an interesting site of many things pushing and pulling, and Kyoko, you made me think about how we communicate with each other, you know, how we're communicating with each other today. You know, I'm definitely feel starved of connection. And I really am appreciating this conversation, talking to you. But I wonder if what we lose when we, you know, because I'm sure we speak very differently in a local context. And then when we speak together, you know, this is more of a kind of global, like, what do we then choose? Then are we selective with the language that we choose to use? So, and then how can we bring the localized to this discussion? The other questions I was thinking about is, how do we open ourselves up for connection when we've become so insular? How do we ground our interactions when we are not physically together? And how do we find that common ground? Travel is a luxury. Like, I really wanted to say that, but I miss it a lot. And I miss, it's such a privilege, but when I've met you, Alvin, and Vonnie, when we've met in person, and I hope to meet Kyoko and Ranjit, I hope to meet you in person too one day. There's always a sense of gathering through food, and walking, you know, just kind of earthing and grounding as part of the gathering. So how can we translate that in the virtual sense? And I have to say that I've been experiencing, this is just a personal note rather than a broader note, but I experience a lot of anxiety in the online space, a space that I believe has been corrupted, colonized, and encourages us to be competitive with each other in a way that I find quite difficult. So I'm not on social media, and I really just hide. But what I do miss out, I miss out on that connection. So I really I'm missing that. I also wanted to just say about the environment. I've been working with this visual artist called Megan Cope this week, and she talks about her sense of obligation to a future, not a close future, but a future hundreds of years in the future, where ancient practices and ancient relations with the land are valued. And that's a really important thing for me to also think about. And I also think about what Sarah Salah says, which is solidarity is a verb. In terms of, I've been reading a lot as a way of finding connection, and I've recently read a beautiful collection of poetry called Take Care by Eunice Andrade, who's a Filipina Australian poet, and she talks a lot about, just to bounce on Ranjit's kind of talk to us about care and healing. She talks about the gendered, racialized labor of care, and how this has been particularly amplified during these times. I will lastly just say a bit of insight on why I love traveling so much is I'm thinking about Larissa Berendt, who also has a recent book called After Story, a novel, and she says being overseas as an Aboriginal person, you feel free. So I'll end it with that.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you for reminding us of that lovely time we had in Bremen together. And it's important to me to remember that, because it's reminded me that an important part of connection aren't just words, aren't just the things we say and do to and with each other, but also the silences, also the speechlessness, over the things that are, for want of a better word, non-verbal, and presence, right? Just that being with, which so much of what we call care is entangled with, this being with. And I think words, we're writers and we count on words and we depend on them. They are our comfort. You know, we resort to words. But there is a way in which we should also, and we do actually, I believe, or the best writers do, understand the power of the silences and the things that words are not meant to do, that we must also tend to. And it's so much of, you know, being together is that as well. But there must be, and there could be, and there should be other ways in which we can tend to these things. At this point, I think I want to just give voice to some of the comments that have been coming up from the audience, because I think they speak to what we've been talking about. And please, I would, if you're in the audience, please do continue to post your comments and questions in the Q&A, and we will try and surface them as much as possible. There is one general question I think I would like to voice, which is an anonymous question. Great point about how to create connections beyond English. Would any of the panel like to comment on how writers can encourage our readers in making these connections? I think that's a nice broad way to pull some of our ideas together. Would anyone like to chip in on this? Please go ahead. Yvonne?
Okay, let me just unmute. Can you hear me or no? Oh, you can. I can't hear myself. Well, first, just a couple of things. Beyond the and coming directly from a very multilingual space, in which we grow up with 3 languages, speaking at least 3 languages in the house and hearing at least 7 languages around us. And it's only stepping out into the world that you realize, oh my goodness, the world does not actually operate like this, and this is not the norm. So and reflecting on this, partly out of mischief, I guess I started saying it, but it's probably true. This capacity has turned people like me into code switchers, shape changers, and those are superpowers, aren't they? But also an awareness then of Englishes, the promiscuity of language. Language does not actually give a damn about where it lands. I've been watching language, and it really doesn't care as long as it can grow, and it will acquire wings whatever wings it needs in order to thrive. So it's not necessarily. Maybe I'm being disingenuous, trying to separate the culture, a people's culture, from the language. But there's that element in language, the way it evolves, and I think of it as a living entity. I wonder then if there's a possibility then for the reader to how do you say, learn to decode the subtext within a text that is given to them. It may look like English, but I can promise you in so many ways it actually is not. Just because the words are English words, it's the way it is put together, and probably the humus that has fed that particular way of Englishing, that may be something that the reader can look at, and it also gives the reader a chance to be a code switcher, a shape changer, a person engaging in their superpowers.
Thank you, Yvonne. Anyone else from the panel want to think about this topic and share on this topic? Kyoko, Ranjit, Ellen?
It's such a wonderful remark. Yeah, Yvonne had totally agree with that. And on top of that, if you, well, you know, I encourage people to try to learn, you know, different languages, particularly those that are far away from your native language. So if your native language is English, instead of, well, learning French is wonderful, learning Spanish is wonderful, but try out like, Chinese, for instance. Because even if you don't become fluent, it kind of opens up a new world, the different logic and different worldview, etc. And if that this is something I benefited greatly from English language. I grew up in Japanese, of course, and once I had English, I could read translations of different languages into English, and that is very different experience from reading translations of different languages into Japanese. So if you are good enough with second, third languages, try out translations of different languages into that. And that would, like Yvonne said, opens up, like, they're not just, it's not just English. They're Englishes, and even in the Chinese is, and
and even Japanese's, right? Like different regional dialects and
dialect. Still, I feel strange about the kind of Japanese people speak on TV. Yes.
And I think it's also about we've for some reason been all conditioned to be uncomfortable with being confused and with not knowing and with ambiguity and this not knowing, this in a sense, that innocent ignorance is pretty much the norm. There's so much on this heaven on earth than is dreamed of in our philosophies. Why do we assume we're supposed to know things? And maybe we need to cultivate both in ourselves and maybe in our readers a greater comfort with not knowing to begin with and needing to reach out and to learn things, right? Basic values like curiosity, generosity, patience. One of the things reading taught me when I was younger was patience, because I essentially was left in the library while my parents went shopping for hours on end, and reading was how I occupied myself. I think that's a superpower. The related question from the audience, and maybe that has to be the last one for the for today. Turning it back to us as writers, with COVID having uprooted our sense of structure and time, how do we cope as writers? How does our writing practice look like today, and how do we deal with all these pressures and all these different demands on our time? So there was a question about what can we do for our readers, and in a sense, this is a question of how do we manage ourselves? What can we do for ourselves? Anyone? Ranjit, do you want to take this? Or?
Yeah, I have to say, in the first round of the lockdown, I mean, my survival strategy was to just see it as an extended writing residency and to just tell myself that no matter what, I was going to continue doing whatever I was. But out of that came a number of interesting, at least to me, outcomes. One of which has to do with this question of multiple languages that we've been talking about, because I grew up very multilingual, and I write in English because that's a historical circumstance. It's in no way an alien language to me because it's been in the family for actually literally 2.5 centuries. But I used this time last year to refamiliarize myself with languages that I hadn't been reading systematically in. So I just set myself a curriculum of reading Hindi poetry, for instance. And that was deeply nourishing, exactly as Kyoko and Yvonne have said. I mean, you're dealing with another shape of thought, another sensibility, you are shape-shifting. And I have a sense that it's this kind of cross-training that will be an important part of our practice as we go forward. It's about responding to the crisis in imaginative ways, taking ourselves out of whatever genre we're in, experimenting with other forms of writing, engaging with other languages. And it's we are stretching our imagination, because this is really what we do, and this is how best we can also respond to our readers, by continually surprising ourselves and them, I think. And to me, that's been a key lesson from this period.
Thank you, Ranjit. Ellen?
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to answer it, but it's a very good question. I think I've been working in visionary fiction. I feel like that's been a really generative form for me right now, and probably wouldn't have been if it wasn't for the last 2 years. Have either of you changed genre since, or well, what is genre, but do you know what I mean? Have you changed direction in your writing?
That's actually a good question. I think, speaking for myself, I think I've been more prepared to play. And it's a sort of waiting for Godot situation where what else is there to do but kill time, as it were, and spend time and play. One of the things I've been doing is to find playmates that are available, that are possible at this time. So, for example, I've been writing poems back and forth with the British poet George Surtees, and I think a book will come of that. And what I've found is in the back and forth, we've been morphing, we've been playing, we've been writing different kinds of things to each other that sort of start to bend or break, all these genre boundaries that have, that we've been assuming. Something happens when you extend a project, or for that matter, a residency, in a sense, beyond its stretching point. Beyond its breaking point, and maybe this is an experiment in that. What happens when you lock up a bunch of writers, or for that matter, people, for extended period of time? And maybe that's how I would love to hear from you all. I have noticed myself paying a lot more attention to my immediate surroundings. My home city, even my garden is thriving, because for the first time in years, I've had time to actually pay attention to my mint and basil and actually weed and water them. So there is in a sense a sharpening and narrowing of attention that not a bad thing for writing, I would say. How has it been for you all? Yeah. Maybe we could finish off with maybe just thoughts. I think we have busted out time, actually. So maybe the right thing to do right now is how about a wish? Maybe we could all end with something we hope to see or hope will happen in the year to come.
Okay. Let me start, because my wish is very, very specific. That this kind of that we get to meet. Let's meet on Pate Island, the place where time has stopped still, and history is blurred, and the fortresses and the mysteries of the past still linger. And that's what I'd want. I'd want us to meet on this island. For weeks and weeks on end, and having these kind of conversations with great food and the sea nearby. That's my wish.
Yes, likewise for me. I really travel and meeting friends and colleagues like yourselves. It would be marvelous for us to be able to retrieve that in the year to come.
Right. Yeah. And I'm hoping that, we can welcome the first batch of three-dimensional writers in Kyoto.
Yeah.
Yes, I want all those things as well. If we wish really hard, maybe if we all have the same wish, maybe it will happen. Yeah.
Yes.
My own wish is all those things, but that we will and can continue this conversation. That is not a one-off. This is, another episode in our ongoing running series, as it were. And may we continue this and other important conversations in all the ways we can, including meeting in person. However that we keep connecting through words and through our silences, and certainly Pate Island, please. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, friends. Thank you to our
Thank you for this. Thank you for this soul nourishing, soul healing. Thank you.
This will be available online. I will circulate the Q&A, whatever we have online, so that the ideas continue to spread. There is another session of this series coming up. I believe Marie and Andrew might be flashing that screen as well. Oh, there you go. That's the next one to look forward to.
Oh, great.
So, not farewell, but au revoir till the next time.